The, the number of children being diagnosed with all manner of mental health conditions is going up on both sides of the Atlantic. The New York Times, I think 4 weeks ago, had a front page headline article about a teenager who was on 10 different psychiatric medications, if you can believe it. 10. That's inexcusable. It shows the utter bankruptcy of the psychiatric system. Rather than looking at the root sources of why this teenager is having her angst and her difficulties, they just keep trying to soothe the symptoms by adding more pharmacology. 10 different medications. Nobody should be on 10 different psychiatric medications. Nobody in the world should be on 10 different psychiatric medications.
What do we do? What is the solution, ultimately, to this crisis?
Well, the first step, I'd say, on both the social and individual level is to wake up. It's just to get that what we think is normal is not normal. Once you get it, then we can start inquiring about, well, what are the beliefs that run my life? And how did I acquire those beliefs? Some years ago, I was leading a retreat with ayahuasca, and one of my children came to visit one of these retreats, and that child came to me with tears in their eyes. Dad, you're almost like a guru to all these people. Why can't you be like that at home? And these were tears of rage is what they were. There was such a gap between how I showed up out in the world and then how I showed up at home. It's more like you have to be a complete person, in all aspects of your life, when you're not looking for the outside to complete the emptiness inside.
The world is changing. Inspiration is everywhere. It has never been so easy to connect, share, and bring people together. We're learning from others and finding the best in ourselves. Challenging our beliefs. Sharing our vulnerability. Overcoming our fears. Transforming ourselves so we can transform the world. How far can we go?
This is London Real. I am Brian Rose. My guest today is... This is London Real. I am Brian Rose. My guest today is Dr. Gabor Maté, the physician, trauma expert, international speaker, and best-selling author. You are best known for your pioneering work in the areas of addiction, stress, and mental health in adults brought on through childhood trauma and abuse. As a physician in your hometown of Vancouver, you spent over a decade treating thousands of patients with your innovative approach. As the best-selling author of 5 books that have been translated in over 30 languages, you were awarded the Hubert Evans Prize for Literary Nonfiction. You have also received the prestigious Honor of the Order of Canada in recognition of your commitment to bringing about societal change and your groundbreaking work in the field of mental illness and addiction. You are a vocal advocate of the use of ayahuasca as a natural therapy, and your latest book, The Myth of Normal: Trauma, Illness, and Healing in a Toxic Culture, examines the worrying rise of chronic sickness throughout the Western world that prides itself on being at the forefront of modern-day healthcare. Gabor, welcome back to London Real.
Brian, it's just great to be back with you.
Fantastic having you here. I don't know if this is your 4th or 5th time, but we always seem to go super deep. You usually turn the tables on me, and usually end up going deep on my own struggles with addiction and my struggles with parenting and raising children. And yeah, I just want to say congratulations. I know your book has just hit the New York Times bestseller list. I think it was the #1 book in Canada. And I see you on all the biggest and best podcasts in the world. And I'm just so happy to see the world finally waking up to your incredible ideas and IP. How does that feel at 78 years old? I was joking earlier that you're an overnight success.
Yeah, local boy makes good, It's very satisfying, and I also have to say, as my wife will tell you, it comes at a time when my ego won't run away with me completely, because had to come earlier, I might not have been able to handle it. But right now, you know what? I just think that the work that I've done, and not the work that I've done, but the work of many people that I'm able to synthesize and translate into language that people can relate to. The time has come for the world to pay attention, and not to me personally, but to the overall themes that I am engaged with.
And why do you think now that you're getting so much recognition? I mean, I know you haven't published a book in what, 3 or 4 years? And again,
Make that 13 years.
Oh, 13 years. Wow, since you published. And again, I think you and I were talking earlier, people know your material through conversations you've had on independent media, including our show over the years. Maybe they were waiting for a good reason to have you on, and then you have this groundbreaking book that you've spent so much time on and co-wrote with your son. Was this just kind of a perfect storm for finally you being out in the open and being in the front pages?
Well, I think quite beyond me, in the last 10, 15 years, there's been increasing awareness on the part of more people that something is fundamentally wrong. As a society goes into crisis, which Western society clearly is facing, more people start looking for answers. They start looking for the roots of problems rather than just, how to deal with the symptoms. And so my work has coincided with that. And so, and when you say perfect storm, then in the aftermath of the COVID epidemic, which I know you've covered from various angles, people are hurting. Should we go back to the normal? But then people say, well, what was the normal before? Wasn't so good, was it? So I think more people are asking questions. And so anybody who has some degree of answers and wants to delve into the deeper issues, like myself, we get some attention now.
Yeah. And you mentioned COVID. I think the last time you were on was April 2020. Everything was just starting to happen. You were in that room, I remember. We had never done a remote episode before. Usually you're in London, in my studio in a chair right across from me. And you were talking about what you were trying to deal with there in Vancouver. And I know that was also a chance where you canceled all your travel arrangements and you actually had the chance to work on this book and also see maybe all this additional trauma going on in the world because of all of that lockdown. Maybe talk a little bit about that and then jump into the book. I mean, The Myth of Normal really talks about these chronic disorders and these mental disorders that now seem to have become normalized. But if you look back 100,000 years ago, it wasn't necessarily what we were experiencing as hunter-gatherers, was it?
No, it wasn't. Well, the pandemic, whatever side of the vaccine debate or the mandate debates one finds oneself on, but globally, the pandemic certainly revealed certain aspects of our society that we should have been aware of before, but we weren't paying maybe that much attention to. For one thing, didn't it just teach us how important human contact and communal presence is? Didn't we just suffer because of the isolation? Now, whether you agree with the policies, I'm not getting into that debate now, but it certainly taught us the importance of each other, of the we that contains the me, and no, but on the other hand, loneliness has been rising in Western societies for decades, to the point that Britain, where you live, has had to appoint a minister for loneliness. And loneliness is as much of a risk factor for illness as smoking 15 cigarettes a day. So COVID certainly brought that home, or ought to have brought it home. Then, when you look at who was most prone to get COVID, it did happen to be the most ostracized and least privileged segments of society, the Black, immigrant, colored populations of so-called colored in the States and also in the UK. They were more prone to get infected and to die of the infections. So again, the impact of inequality on health has been studied for decades in Britain by people like Sir Michael Marmot and Richard Wilkinson and others, and documented. The social gradient in health has been documented for a long time. COVID again brought it home. COVID also brought home, again, and no matter which side of the debate you might find yourself on, but the importance of looking for social solutions, for really working together to work our way out of a crisis. So all these factors have been, on the one hand. On the other hand, COVID also increased the rate of people using drugs and addictions, which shows the role that trauma and stress plays in people's self-soothing behaviors. Under COVID, the incidence of child abuse went up. More children end up in emergency wards with injuries. Domestic violence went up. So again, the role of stress and the underlying trauma that get uncovered by a social crisis. There's many lessons in COVID that, looking back, we could have learned earlier, and perhaps we'll learn them now, but I'm not so sure that we will. But again, COVID highlighted some of the tensions and contradictions in what we call the normal.
And now in a post-COVID world, I think it is at least post-COVID-ish, like what are some of the glaring issues that we're facing? Is it something like the teenage mental illness and suicide issues? What are the big things on your radar that really you want to talk about with a book like this to get people's attention that something's not right here, something's not normal?
Well, you began your question by referring to teenage mental health. The number of children being diagnosed with all manner of mental health conditions is going up on both sides of the Atlantic. The New York Times, I think 4 weeks ago now, as we speak today, had a front page headline article about a teenager who was on 10 different psychiatric medications, if you can believe it. 10. That's inexcusable. It shows the utter bankruptcy of the psychiatric system, that rather than looking at the root sources of why this teenager is having her angst and her difficulties, that you just keep trying to soothe the symptoms by adding more pharmacology. 10 different medications. Nobody should be on 10 different psychiatric medications. Nobody in the world should be on 10 different psychiatric medications. The rise in childhood suicides, the articles, at least on this side of the Atlantic, but I know in Britain it's the same case. Articles in the New York Times and the New Yorker wringing their hands about the alarming rise in childhood suicides. But the conversation always takes place without any mention of trauma, which is the fundamental dynamic in all of these conditions. And so on the one hand, we're desperate over the rising tide of mental distress that's besetting our youth. On the other hand, we're not looking at the causes, and that's one of the intentions of our book, is to look at, well, what's really going on here.
Let's talk about trauma a little bit, because I distinctly remember you being here in London 4 or 5 years ago when we sat down and we were talking about, I'd gone to run an Ironman race, and my nemesis on the race was John Joseph, and he had suffered some childhood sexual abuse. And I was kind of revisiting some of the issues of my parents getting divorced when I was 7. And I remember I casually remarked to you, Gabor, I said, well, my trauma was nowhere near as bad as John Joseph's trauma. And you said, hold on, Brian, that's not true. Because if you didn't properly, I think, process it mentally, it's very hard to quantify trauma. You know, you might say, well, this was an act that seems more damaging than this. But, you know, you had a great way of trying to explain trauma. And I know in the book you talk about a capital T and maybe a small t trauma. Did I understand what you were saying to me right? And how do you kind of talk about or explain trauma to people?
Yeah, I think you got it. The first principle to understand is that trauma is not what happens to you. So if you look at John Joseph's case, in your case, you might say, well, he was really traumatized. I wasn't, because you're looking at what happened to you. But trauma is not what happened to you. Trauma is what happens inside you. So trauma actually comes from a Greek word for wound. So trauma is the wound that you sustain. It's not the hit, it's the concussion, you know, and everybody reacts differently to external events. So first of all, trauma is the internal wound. That's the first point. The second point is an exercise they often do with people. When they think back to their own childhoods, they don't see it as a big deal, but then have no standard of comparison. But your parents, when they got divorced, and I forgot what conversations we may have had around that, but your parents, when they got divorced, they didn't all of a sudden wake up from a happy marriage and say, sweetheart, it's been wonderful, goodbye. There would have been years of tension, you know, and maybe, I don't know what happened in your family, but I mean, I know what happened in my marriage, you know, and there's a lot of tension in a home which ends in divorce. Now, if you take one of your children and plug them, just imagine with your home, with your spouse, that same degree of tension or rancor, unhappiness that led to your parents' divorce. Imagine one of your children living in that environment for years. Would you still dismiss it as no big deal? You know, clearly you would say, this child, I wouldn't want my child to go through that degree of difficulty. So we tend to dismiss our own experience as irrelevant when we compare it to others. But there's no comparing trauma, because trauma is not what happens. It's the wound that you sustain inside. And when you mention the small t and the big T, sexual abuse is what you call a big T trauma. I mean, that just really hurts. But you can have the wound sustained, especially by sensitive kids, in homes where nobody abused them, but they didn't meet their needs for emotionally being seen and understood. Maybe they had to deal with a parent who was depressed, or a parent who was just emotionally unavailable, like I was to my kids, and those kids are still wounded. So again, trauma is that wound. It's not the event. And from that point of view, it's almost irrelevant. Although I do delineate the big tree from the small tree, in practice, the degree of wounding, it's almost irrelevant to make those distinctions.
Yeah, you really taught me that, because when my parents got divorced when I was 7, I didn't really have anyone to talk to about it at the time. Therapy wasn't a thing. There were, nothing online obviously back then, and I think I was just left to kind of stew in my own issues. And my personality was different than my brother, who was 2 years older than me, than my sister, who was 4 years younger than me. We all dealt with it in our own way. And for me, it was just to believe that I could never trust anybody in the world, that it was just going to be me against everything else. I had to be self-reliant. I couldn't rely on anybody.
So just imagine for a moment one of your children in that situation, how your heart would break for them, and that was your situation, and it's the situation of a lot of children in our society.
Yeah. And so there's the big T's, but those small T's can be there without us necessarily knowing, and they can add up over time, right? That neglect, or that low level of criticism can just add up over time, to where obviously that's being manifested in what we see today by these large-scale societal symptoms that you're observing.
Well, when you talked about your sense that you can't trust anybody, you can't trust the world. I mean, that's devastating for a child. Now project that into the COVID crisis, and all the mistrust and all the suspicion and all the rancor, I mean, on all sides. To me, it didn't just speak about the urgency of the issues being discussed. It's also talked about who was doing the discussing. A lot of people who didn't trust, but the lack of trust. Now, there's all kinds of good reasons not to trust governments and corporations and so on. I mean, I talk about that in the book, there's all kinds of, overall, I don't have a conspiracy theory view of the world, but there certainly are conspiracies that we know this all the time. People telling us lies and selling us stuff we don't need, and telling us it's good for us when it's bad for us, all this kind of stuff. But at the same time, a lot of the suspicion and rancor that I saw on the COVID debate, I was seeing the impact of childhood trauma, where people just couldn't even consider another point of view, no matter from what side, and just the suspicion, well, if a child is given the sense early that the world is not trustworthy, that's going to show up in politics. That's going to show up in our social discourse.
Right. So I see what you're saying. It was almost like the COVID perturbed the system, and from that tremor, you could see the embodiment of perhaps decades of trauma on a society, on the world, and now you could see these reactions that just didn't seem logical, normal, but we had never had a society this traumatized. And so that's I guess that's what you witnessed when you saw that.
That sums it up. I remember reading about a pastor and about podcaster in Florida, who apparently has got hundreds of thousands of followers, and he believed that the vaccine was a conspiracy by the Clintons and Bill Gates to introduce a microchip into people's circulations just to control them. Okay? Now, if this guy went to a doctor and said, I believe that there's a conspiracy to put a microchip into my circulation so that I could be controlled, he'd be diagnosed as a paranoid schizophrenic. But when you put it into the COVID debate, it sounded plausible to a lot of people. Now, it's not that I put conspiracies past the Clintons or the Gates or anybody, anything is possible in this world. But I don't, for one thing, I don't think they have the technology yet to introduce microchips into people's circulations through a vaccine, on the most basic level. But when I thought about that man who had that theory, I thought, well, at some point, from an emotional point of view, it makes sense, because I'm pretty sure that at some point, he probably was very small and very helpless, and people were controlling him in a way that was harmful to him. In other words, he was projecting into the political debate a personal experience of trauma, not realizing that that's what he's doing. So that, to me, there's always a kind of emotional sense behind even the most fanciful ideas, that even if the content of the ideas seems self-evident nonsense, the emotional contact, I think, comes from trauma.
Okay. Yeah, you mentioned medication earlier, and I'd love to talk about it. I think you said at one point that 70% of all adult Americans are on a medication.
Something like 70% are at least on one medication, yeah.
And 40% are on two or more.
That's the statistic that I saw from the Mayo Clinic, I think.
What do you make of that? And as a doctor yourself, what is the right amount? What is the solution? What is the future? What does that tell you?
So we can look upon pathology as individual misfortune or genetic inheritance. But that doesn't explain why I think the rising rate of people on medications, because genes don't change over a short period of time. Now, if you put aside the issue of individual pathology, and if you say, well, what's going on in a society, then you have to understand the scientific basis. This is not fancy. This is not intuition. It's not conjecture. People are actually biopsychosocial creatures. That means that our biology is very much affected by our psychology. And needless to say, our psychology cannot help be affected by our social relationships from in utero onwards. So we already know from lots of studies that the emotional states of the mother while she's carrying the baby has an impact on the brain development of the fetus and on the future physiology of the infant. You can trace this for decades after the pregnancy itself. So, in other words, the emotional states of the mother affect the physiology of the infant, but the emotional states of the mother are obviously connected to her social situation, her economic status, her own family history, her own history of trauma, her own race, and so on. So that what we call individual pathology is actually the manifestation of a biopsychosocial process. That's our scientific nature, or scientifically stated, that's our nature as human beings. So therefore, we can, now indigenous, by the way, I know you and I have both worked with indigenous modalities, and indigenous cultures have always understood this. They didn't have the science that we have, and thank God for the science that we do have. But our science has become so narrowed. So a friend of mine, a Lakota Sioux, partial Lakota Sioux, born American physician and psychiatrist, Dr. Louis Mel Madrona, told me that in his Lakota tradition, when somebody got ill, the whole community would kind of gather and say, thank you. Your illness manifests some imbalance in the whole community. So that you're not alone in this, and your healing is our healing. And from a scientific point of view, that's absolutely true. It's just that Western medicine ignores both that traditional wisdom and all the science that proves that traditional wisdom. So we really are biopsychosocial creatures. If that's the case, then if we have to want to look at the sources of the rising tide of illnesses, physical and mental, we have to look at social conditions and social relationships and the whole nature of the culture that we inhabit and the values that we live by and how we treat each other and how we interact with each other and the kind of stresses that we live under. That's just pure science. And again, I cannot emphasize the frustration sometimes that looking at the gap between what science has shown and what physicians practice, and it's not their fault, dear souls, it's because there's nothing in their education prepares them for it. Not only that, physicians themselves are so traumatized by their training that they just don't look at these issues because they're too painful.
Can we talk about what you just said? Traumatized by the way they're trained with the hours,
Yeah.
or also with, I don't know all the details of what it's like being trained for a doctor, but I hear about the hours. It sounds like it hasn't really changed much in 50 years. It also sounds like it's an industry that's somehow co-opted ultimately by the pharmaceutical industry, and maybe it's to where there's just one solution. And then when you get out and you're a doctor, the economics of your practice mean that you're really writing blood pressure scripts one every 12 minutes to make sure you can kind of pay the bills. That's a lot of things wrong with the way we actually treat the mental and physical wellness of all of our citizens. What do you see there? Because obviously you're a doctor.
It's absolutely true. So somebody once said, how do you create a cult? Well, you put them under authority and leaders. You give them a special jargon that they only understand. You give them a uniform. You separate them from their families, and you sleep deprive them. In other words, you send them to medical school, and there's a couple of interesting studies. One of them shows that the highest level of empathy a physician has is at the beginning of their training. Number one. Number two, there's this interesting little structure at the end of our chromosomes called telomeres or telomeres. Somebody won a Nobel Prize in 2015 for her Elizabeth Blackburn, an American researcher, for her work on telomeres. And telomeres basically are like the glue at the end of your shoelace. They keep the strands together. And we have 10,000 units when we're born. And as we age and as we get stressed, they fray and they shorten. And the shorter they are, the more aged we are, biologically speaking. So, for example, if you look at the telomeres of Black Americans, they're several years shorter than those of Caucasians, strictly because of the stress of racism. And now they looked at the telomeres of medical residents. They frayed, aged faster in a year than other people their age. So, these are the people, and in the book I talk about my friend, Dr. Lisa Rankin, who's an obstetrician. In her training, she, as a resident, apart from the fact that she's sexually harassed by her professors, but one night, 4 babies died in the delivery suite. And she was crying in the doctor's room, and she was told to get out there and get back to work. And another friend of mine, Dr. Jeff Rediger, who's a psychiatrist at Harvard, who's written a book on what's called spontaneous remissions, which are not spontaneous at all. But Jeff, when he was a resident, he had a baby born. They had a baby who had to end up in the infant intensive care unit. Jeff was not given a moment off work to go visit him. The school apologized to him afterwards. But that's medical training for a lot of people. Well, that hardens you to your own pain, and you don't see the pain of your clients, let alone does the average, despite, there's a Dr. Richard Bentall, who's a British psychologist, member of the British Academy. And he said that the evidence linking childhood adversity, basically trauma, to adult mental health conditions is as strong as the evidence linking cigarette smoking to lung cancer. But despite that documented and over-documented fact, the average medical student in Britain, United States, Canada, doesn't get a single lecture on a relationship of trauma and adult illness. And recently I was contacted by a professor from one of the most prestigious British universities who's having all manner of medical issues, and tried to get one of the psychiatrists at his institution to help. None of them could even understand what he was talking about. He was trying to understand the sources of trauma and stress as the impact on his physical health. Not a single psychiatrist in an institution was able to help him. They just don't get it. It's not in their training. No, there are honorable exceptions, but I'm talking about as a professional trend.
And these are people on the front line that 90-some% of the Western world trusts with their health, and will take pretty much any pill they prescribe, and will do whatever they say to solve their problems. These are the people.
Exactly right. These people are stressed themselves and very often traumatized themselves, number one. And number two, they understand nothing about the trauma of the people that they're trying to help. And this despite the fact that not only mental health conditions, but documentedly, most chronic physical health conditions can also be linked to trauma and stress.
So I don't want to skip to the end, but a part of me wants to say, what do we do? What do we do, doctor? Like, what do we do about all this? And you're getting a lot of attention now with this book, which is fantastic. But, you know, what do we do? What is the solution ultimately to this crisis?
Well, there needs to be a solution both on the individual and on the social levels, you know. And the subtitle of the book is Trauma, Illness, and Healing in a Toxic Culture. But healing is in there. So, I mean, we can't wait for social conditions to change and for the policymakers to get it. You know, people do need to act, take responsibility for their own health, you know, in the face of daunting conditions. Well, the first step, I'd say, in both the social and individual level is to wake up. It's just to get that what we think is normal is not normal. That the way we're living, there's this confusion between the word normal and natural and healthy. We tend to conflate the two, which is true in certain areas. For example, as a physician, I can tell you that outside a certain normal range of blood acidity or blood temperature or blood pressure, we can't sustain life. So that range is normal, and it's also healthy and natural. But when we apply that to social conditions or the way we live our lives or the assumptions we make about ourselves, what is the norm is no longer healthy nor natural. So the first step is we got to wake up to that fact. We just got to get it. Once you get it, then we can start inquiring about, well, what are the beliefs that run my life and how did I acquire those beliefs? Like if in your case, at some point, you probably had to ask yourself, how is it that I don't trust the world? How is it that I lack trust? And well, okay, stuff happened to me. It's not, I was born trusting, weren't you? As an infant, you're full of trust. Yeah. In fact, you have to be. Look at, you know, so if I developed a lack of trust, number one, how did I develop it? And number two, how's that affecting my life today? How's that affecting my capacity to interact with human beings, to have intimate relationships? How does it affect how I relate to myself and my work and so on? So there's got to be this awakening and there's got to be an inquiry.
Yeah, I almost have to kind of counteract my trust issues and just force myself to trust because I know I have this paranoid deficit of that. So I'm a little more self-aware. I think after you and I spoke, when I was filming our last movie, Reconnect, I went home and actually put my mom and dad on camera and asked them about the divorce. I probably traumatized them by doing it. But I got...
No, you didn't. You may have upset them, but you didn't traumatize them.
Right, okay, that's a good point. I definitely upset my dad, I think. But I completely re-understood what happened there, and it wasn't the story I had told myself. I actually saw it from their perspective and their growth, and then I kind of got to see the benefits I got from it, and I unpacked the whole piece to where, for me now, that's no longer necessarily a bad thing that happened to me. It's just something that happened to me that has positives and things I need to look out for now. So I've kind of processed it, I guess, I think. I'm sure there's parts I haven't.
So there's a film made on my work called The Wisdom of Trauma, which, by the way, is available online. And one of the senses in which I mean the wisdom of trauma is that if you work it through, you do gain a lot of wisdom. You learn a lot, don't you, about yourself and the world. Not that we should deliberately traumatize anybody so that they can learn from it. I mean, there's other ways of learning, but the fact is that people that have worked through their trauma, like a lot of people, as you know, through the addiction world, who have really looked at their habits and where they came from, and they learn a lot about themselves. And to that degree, they become much more at peace with themselves and the world, and much more compassionate in their approach to themselves and to other people. So there's a wisdom to be gleaned from working through one's trauma.
Yeah. You know, in the book, you talk about, you know, anger and rage and some other primal emotions like lust and fear. And you kind of talk about them as if it's something that we need to understand, that these are emotions, which means by definition, they're not wrong. And there's a place for them as opposed to just suppressing them. And I wanted to ask you about that because my boys are now 5 and 6 years old, Damon and Caden. And, you know, we have rage that happens between these two brothers. And sometimes it can result in a hit or a bite. And I'm constantly trying to manage it to where I don't want them to suppress it, but I kind of want to get them to observe it to where maybe they don't have to just behave, to react immediately to it. And I'm sure I'm doing some things wrong, but how do you get us as adults and maybe even children to get in touch with these primal emotions and allow them to flow, but also not allow them to dominate us?
Yeah, I mean, I certainly remember the same dynamic between my two sons who were 3.5 years apart, and sometimes it was so distressing, because you want love in your family. You don't want these kids hating each other, Well, so first of all, sibling rivalry is as old as humankind. It seems like if you go back to Cain and Abel in the Bible, not a very happy outcome, but it's certainly that old. So much of it depends on how the parents. First of all, the oldest child never demanded that you bring somebody new into the house to dethrone him from the parents' attention. Why should he like it? Why should he not resent it? The younger child never had the experience of not being dominated by and kind of looked down on and resented by, or that's the youngest child experience by somebody older, and so there's going to be conflict there. By the way, especially in modern society, because the other thing we have to say here is that human beings were never meant to parent in isolated nuclear families. So that we evolved. You referred earlier to the hunter-gatherer phase, which even in the life of our own species, Homo sapiens, let alone our hominin evolutionary ancestors, which we're talking millions and hundreds of thousands of years. But just take the life of our own species. If the life of our own species, Homo sapiens, can be expressed in 1 hour, then until 6 minutes ago, we lived in hunter-gatherer tribes. And children were not stuck in a home, 2 siblings with parents who, one of them was away the whole day working at least. They were out there in nature, playing with multiple playmates of all ages under the benevolent gaze of adults. There you wouldn't have had this dynamic,
right.
So part of it is a function of what we like to call our civilization. But now that we're here, so one of the determinants of how this will go down is how do you react when this happens? If you can stay mindful and calm and connected and regulated, that'll teach the kids that it's possible to stay regulated in the presence of stress. If you get all uptight like I did and start yelling and so on, that just feeds the fuel for their fire, So part of it depends on how do the parents respond. Secondly, naturally, you can't allow kids to hate each other. You just can't allow the older one to beat up the younger one. You can't allow that. But the question is, who steps in? Is it a rageful, triggered adult? Or is it a self-regulated adult who says, no, your brother's not for hitting? And in that moment, you're not trying to teach anything. You're just simply trying to teach that this is not acceptable, period. But you're not teaching emotional self-regulation. Now, after the episode is over and you're reconnected with the child, and you're both calm, then you say, oh, you must have been very upset when you hit your brother. What was going on for you? You must have been very angry. So you don't try and teach them the language in the middle of the crisis, because in the crisis, they're in flight and fight mode. No learning takes place. So you wait till they're regulated and you're regulated, and then you have this conversation, and that'll teach them, oh yeah, there's other ways of handling this, so that's how you do it. Yeah. That's the first point. The second point, the third point I should say, is this. If this happens a lot, then you have to wonder what's frustrating the kids so much. Now, what frustrates kids is when the needs aren't met. And what's the kid's biggest need? Consistent, emotionally available, attuned adults giving them nurturing contact. So then you have to say, well, am I somehow, because of my own issues and my work concerns and my career drives, am I perhaps depriving them of that nurturing, loving contact that then frustrates them? Then they take their frustration on each other. In other words, we have to look at it from every angle possible, and then we can intervene in a very positive and humane and way that promotes their growth.
Right. So look in the mirror. a little bit, if this is consistently happening with your children. Can we talk about workaholic and workaholism? Because it's something I think both you and I have suffered from in the past. And I think both of us have maybe got our heads around that phenomenon. Doesn't mean that either one of us is better at it. But I know for a while you recognized that, I think both of us actually, we work, which ultimately I think you say we do it because we need to prove to the world that we're worth something, because we don't naturally believe we're worth something just as humans, which of course we are.
Well, we do naturally believe it as an infant, the first day you're born.
Right.
You expect it. You expect to be the most important thing in the universe.
Right.
So, but somehow we learn that we're not. And both you and I learned that through our particular childhood trajectories and the trauma that we sustained. In my case, the learning wasn't purely voluntary. It was in London, not that many years ago, that my wife said to me, I don't know if I told you this before, but she said to me, buddy, you've written a book called When the Body Says No. Now you better write one called When the Wife Says No. Because I'm not putting up with this anymore,
She had enough of your workaholism.
Yeah, and the workaholism and the impact on our relationship.
How did that manifest?
Well, you see, any addiction, and workaholism certainly is one, will be accompanied by withdrawal symptoms. So, and also exhaustion, So I could be out there and be present and grounded and compassionate and utter whatever wisdom I'm capable of channeling in front of hundreds of people. And then I go home and I'd be going through withdrawal, irritable and depressed and alienated and depleted, not available for my spouse, as an equal, emotionally present partner.
Yeah.
And women feel this, and at a certain point, my wife decided she wasn't going to put up with this anymore, but not only that, she wasn't going to try to make it better by compensating and by being nice. And, she was going to say, no, my needs aren't being met here. And either you turn this around or this relationship is in trouble, And I was wise enough by then to listen, And like you say, it's not that I've totally resolved the issue, but I'm much more guarded about it and much more judicious in making my choices.
Which means
I also don't need it. I also don't need it as much anymore. I as much as I love the validation, I also don't need it. I don't need it. I don't need the world to tell me that I'm worthwhile.
Is that because you're getting older, or because you just found it a way to process that to where you don't need it?
I know how to be with the sense that I'm not worth it when it arises. Okay. I know how to notice it as an old imprint and nothing to do with reality.
Okay.
Now look, with all the attention my work is getting and the new book is getting and so on, it's almost impossible not to get seduced by it.
Yeah.
Over and over again, but something in me doesn't buy it anymore.
Even now, because if anything, this should be the hardest thing, the most tempting piece, because you're probably getting 10x the notoriety than you've ever had before in a book. And so this could be the dangerous time, right? The relapse moment for that person to have that drink or for you to go back. But you're finding that you're okay. You can be okay with it.
I'm finding, I don't want to be categorical about it, but I'm finding I'm...
To continue watching the rest of the episode for free, visit our website londonreal.tv or click the link in the description below.